Okay, hi everyone. My name is Katherine Randolph. I'm a Marin Master Gardener since 2011. I'm also the founder of the Marin Master Gardeners Pruning Guild, which we are in our 9th year now. And I'm also an aesthetic pruner working in small gardens. Bill?
And I am Bill Lang. I am a Marin Master Gardener since 2017 and also a member of the Pruning Guild since 2017 and have worked closely with Katherine and am indebted to her since that time.
Yeah, we are partners in crime, so to speak.
Yes.
Throughout this class, we'll be saying trees mostly, but when we say trees, we mean woody trees, woody shrubs, and woody vines. And we are going to stop for questions in each section, after each section. We ask that during the class that you keep your questions kind of general. If you have specific questions just for your tree or your garden, hold those until the end and we'll deal with them then, so we don't take up everybody else's time. So we are Marin Master Gardeners. We're trained by University of California Cooperative Extension to work with homeowners and provide research-based information. Bill, do you want to start here?
Sure, these are the topics that we'll cover today. The purpose of your tree or shrub, what you hope to accomplish with it, the evaluation of the site where you are going to place your tree or shrub, how to select the plant at the nursery, some discussion about how the most important aspects of planting your tree for success and how to ensure that your tree has adequate irrigation, as well as the proper staking to ensure that the tree enjoys a healthy start in life. So we can go on to the next slide. The purpose of your tree or shrub may be a single purpose or many, and the next slide shows that privacy for many is a common goal and purpose. Here, a very healthy and vigorous camellia shrub provides privacy for the home on the left or from this street or driveway on the right, but serves another purpose of a beautiful bloom. I think this is probably a Sasanqua camellia in very early spring. The next slide is a very lovely old tree providing shade for a nap on a hot day or perhaps a glass of Kool-Aid, and certainly is a wonderful purpose for a tree. And on the next slide, another purpose is a focal point, a point for contemplation and perhaps to arouse the envy of your neighbors. But there certainly are trees that can bring beauty to your garden as a focal point. The next shows what I believe is a Japanese magnolia, bringing beauty by way of flowers to a wide and simple lawn landscape here. This is a tree in full bloom and really providing a show for this individual's lot. And then finally, but not last, but not least by any means, many of you may want to grow trees for fruit. Those great big grapefruit on the right are, I'm hoping they're not lemons, but if grapefruit, they look nice and juicy. And those apples on the left are certainly gorgeous. So I think I can turn it over to you, Katherine.
Okay. So now we're going to look at site evaluation. And this is a really critical piece. You want to do this before you go to the nursery, for sure. And we're going to cover a number of pieces of site evaluation. So first is the size of space. Trees are genetically programmed to grow to a specific height and width. And you can prune them if you want, but why? Why don't you find something that actually fits the space? I work as a pruner and I'm constantly trying to convince people to let something grow to its full size. These are some of the problems that come up when you plant something that really doesn't, is not appropriate to its space. You don't want it too close to the foundation if it's something that's going to lift the foundation. You don't want it over the roof, especially now in our area where we're exposed to fire risk. You don't want it coming up against the roof and taking out the gutter. Not helpful. So another thing about your site evaluation is you want to know what's your climate zone. And a lot of you are probably going to be familiar with this. I do have a handout that you will get at the end of the class. And it has 2 pages, and on it, it has the websites for the USDA climate zones and for the sunset zones. And you can zoom in there and figure out where it is that you belong. And basically what they're talking about is how much frost you get and how hot you get. So you're looking for a zone that is appropriate for you. I am in Strawberry. I'm south facing. I very seldom freeze. If I was in Mill Valley proper, down at the bottom of a valley or a canyon, I would for sure get frost. Right here, I'm usually frost free by March 1st or March 15th. If I was in a valley where the cold air sinks down in the winter, it would probably be later, maybe into April.
One thing, I'm sorry, Katherine, to mention is the difference between the USDA and sunset zones. Just they're slightly different, and just if you were just to see one, see the other, and notice that there's a difference, don't fret. Just decide which you're going to use as your baseline. Right.
Okay. And so the other thing that you have, so that's kind of a general. Those climate zones are kind of general, but you also have around your house climate microclimates. So on the south side of my house, I have full sun in much of it. And it's going to get much hotter there. There's probably going to be reflected heat off the south side of the house. On the north side of the house, I have a certain area along about 10 feet out from the house, which is full shade all the time. And so I can put things like camellias in there that I could not put on the south side. The other thing that some plants are sensitive to is wind. So you need to take that into consideration if you're in a spot that's kind of windy. So for sunlight, a lot of people feel like they have a lot of sun because they'll get 4 hours of really intense sun. But full sun means 6 hours a day. So when you're buying a plant and it says full sun, if it doesn't get 6 hours of sun a day, it's going to start to get really leggy and it's never really going to thrive. If it says part sun, it's going to need 4 to 6 hours a day. You're going to need to be careful about that, because if you have 3 hours of a day of really intense sun in the middle of the day or in the late afternoon, the plant may fry if it's something that's really a part sun, part shade plant. Full shade is going to be less than 3 hours a day. And again, it's going to depend on the quality of the sun. So I think most of you probably know that the sun from like 2 o'clock until 6 o'clock is going to be the hottest part of the day. So on the left, we have a plant that has sunburn because it got too much heat. That's something that you can often address when you're doing pruning. But that's going to be a different class, but you need to be careful that you're not putting something in a place where it's going to burn the bark. On the right, we have a citrus that froze. It looks like they either forgot to put the cover on at night or the cover wasn't enough. And you can, so the things that are really sensitive around here to frost are the citrus, and you can wrap them with sheets or whatever when you think there's going to be a cold night. If something is close to the house, it is less likely to freeze. The house is kind of a heat sink, but still you need to be careful. Another big thing for us is water availability. Most of you probably know that we are now in the middle of a drought. We have gotten half of our average rain for this year. We've also gotten more heat. We had more really hot days. I mean, I was out today in my shirt sleeves, not great a sign. So we're headed towards probably water rationing. So is your plant drought tolerant? A lot of your Australian plants are going to be more drought tolerant than a lot of our other ornamental plants that we do. The natives and Mediterranean plants often require less water. If it's next to a lawn, oftentimes the trees and shrubs, their roots will come under the lawn and they will depend on that water. If we have water rationing and you decide not to get rid of your lawn, you have to think about the fact that the trees are relying on that water. I saw a lot of trees die when we had water rationing before because people turned off their lawn and didn't bother to irrigate for the trees, so they lost them. Another thing to think about is what's your soil type. Most of what we have here in Marin is clay, which can be very heavy and difficult for some plants to tolerate. On some of the websites that you can go to do your research, it will talk about what soils the plants and trees can tolerate. Let's see. The clay soils are oftentimes alkaline, and they oftentimes have poor drainage. Because they're composed of small mineral particles, they oftentimes have less need for fertilizer depending on the type of plant. Some plants need acidic soil, your rhodies, camellias, azaleas, and your citrus. So you're going to need to be feeding those with acidic fertilizer, especially on your citrus trees, especially your Meyer lemon, which almost everyone has a Meyer lemon. They are one of the citrus. They're really the only one that produces fruit and flowers all year long. So they have a strong need to be fertilized every month. And if you see the leaves on your citrus getting mottled yellow, oftentimes that means they're not getting enough acidic fertilizer. Let's see. I think I do this section. Okay. So you want to do your research first. And there's a bunch of different websites that allow you to do some research to, by choosing certain characteristics in terms of full sun, drought tolerance, size, etc. Marin Master Gardeners has a lot of information on their website. Monrovia is one of the big growers in the country. One thing you need to be aware of is that Monrovia is based on the East Coast. And so a lot of their information on their website really refers to East Coast weather, not here. San Marcos is one of our local growers. They all have information. Select Tree comes out of Cal Poly San Luis, and they've got a lot of information, especially on the bigger trees. Devil Mountain is a nursery. They are in East Bay, but they've also just started up in Sonoma, and they also have a website which has some information available. And those websites are available again on the resources list. So all of that information is available to you. You can also call your local nurseries. So we've got Sloats, West End, Armstrong, Green Jeans, etc. They're oftentimes going to know what has worked here and what has not worked, and also what they have available. West End, almost everybody on the staff at West End is very knowledgeable. Sloats, you have to search for some of the people that have been there longer, who have more knowledge. Especially in the summer, they're going to hire a lot of young people who don't have a lot of experience, but usually they'll refer you to somebody. Okay. So again, picking the right tree. Is it going to fit in your space? We've talked about that. Is it messy? I have an Arbutus unado, a strawberry tree, which drops berries all winter, and it's just horrible, and it's right out by the garbage can. So every time we go out to the garbage, we step on it and track it back into the house. Is it going to be hard to grow? Some things are more challenging, and you may want something that you know is going to be kind of foolproof. Are the roots invasive? You've all seen places where either the driveway or the sidewalk or the street has been heaved by roots. Some plants are highly invasive. Monterey pines, which are all over the county, are not native here. They're native down in Monterey, where they get a lot of fog. They're not native here. And they're also prone to pine bark beetle, which is why a lot of them are dying. Palm trees are not native, but they, some of them, I think it's the Mexican fan palm, which you can see growing along the freeway. If you see it growing along the freeway, it's invasive. Almost everybody here knows about broom, which will start blooming next month all over the county. It's very flammable and very invasive. So other things you want to think about when you're choosing is, do you want it to be deciduous or evergreen? If it's working as a privacy hedge, evergreen is going to be important. If it's deciduous, you might, like a lot of the maples, etc., have a really nice silhouette in the winter, which is quite beautiful. And you want colorful foliage. So some things, I believe that tree in the upper picture might be a photinia, which has the new growth that comes in is red in the spring. You might also want to look at shape. Do you want something that's large and weeping? Do you want something that's very vertical, like a Italian cypress? What's your space like? What's that? And that's going to determine your shape. Okay, any questions?
Yes, there is a question. Oh, question. Are coffee grounds a good acidic fertilizer for citrus?
I don't think so. I would use citrus food. You can go to the nursery and get citrus food. Especially your lemons are, since they're heavy feeders, they need a lot of micronutrients. You can also just Google that, look that up and see what it says, but I have never heard of them used for citrus.
Thanks. That was it.
That's it? Okay, great.
Okay, so here you are at the nursery and looking at all these trees, some of which are ugly and others of which may just absolutely capture your heart. But the first thing you can do is read the tag and see whether this is a deciduous tree or evergreen, because many of the deciduous, or excuse me, so decide, you can see whether it's deciduous or evergreen. Critically review on the label the water needs of the plant, the sun needs of the plant, and the size, the height and width. And do not succumb to an endorphin rush. Remember that the growers and the nursery want these plants to be gorgeous, and often they are, sometimes they're not, but often they are, that is because of practices of fertilization and trimming and things that aren't necessarily the best for the plant. So do your homework, do your research, and read the labels at the nursery. And the next slide also, when you are confronted with the specimen, take a look at it in the can and see, can you see the root flare? Can you see the beginning of at the trunk where the roots begin to spread out, as opposed to that photograph on the right where we are saying no telephone poles, which results from planting a shrub or a tree too deeply. The issue here is that although roots have very good resistance to wet soil, trunks do not. The trunk of the tree does not. And this is an invitation for various diseases, especially fungal disease of the trunk. In the next slide.
Yeah, let me just say one thing about that, Bill, which is some plants are really sensitive to being buried too deep and some are not. I know Japanese maples, fruit trees. I lost a gorgeous peach tree one year because I had planted it too deep. Your citrus, I have a client who has a lot of citrus and they're constantly getting buried too deep, and you begin to see the little white mycelium down there, which is the fungal, the fungus beginning to get into the crown. And once the crown rots, the tree will die.
And actually what you can do, even if the tree is planted a bit too deep, you can clear the dirt away so that you can see the crown, even in a well-established tree, clear the dirt away and provide an avenue for moisture to drain off so moisture doesn't accumulate. So at the nursery, you look at the structure of the tree. Does it have a nice straight stem? There should be no low branches. The branches should be balanced, and you should be able to make out a single clear leader. On the other hand, look for codominant leaders. These are leaders that arise both relatively vertical with a very narrow angle at which they arise. The problem here is that at that narrow angle, both of these branches, the trunks of both of these branches, are going to grow in width, in diameter. And as they do, it's going to push the branches apart and weaken that junction. And over time, it will become increasingly weak and increasingly subject to the likelihood of breakage. So if possible, or in fact, just simply avoid codominant leaders. On the next slide, we can look a little bit further at the structure near the base of the plant. And one particular thing to look for are crossing branches, which very frequently will result in rubbing and opening or creating wounds as they grow. This is particularly the case for multi-trunk trees and especially for shrubs. The other problem that can arise, again, more frequently in shrubs, is that dense growth in the crown, in the foliage, can result in shading out of the interior of the tree, thereby killing the interior growth, resulting in poor interior growth of the tree or shrub. So next slide, please. And then at the nursery also, have the nursery attendant take the plant out of the pot. It is not infrequent. It is not uncommon to find examples, perhaps not quite this bad, but nonetheless, either girdling roots or plants that are root bound, which is caused by plants being left in containers longer than should have been. These plants in nurseries are generally raised in a smaller container and then at an appropriate time transferred to a larger container as they grow to give them room. If a plant is left in the smaller container too long, the roots grow, they need somewhere to go, and they begin to grow in circles. This will result in poor vigor and an unstable tree. And I can tell you from personal experience that I have finally given up on a tree that just looked miserable for too long and pulled it out of the ground, and lo and behold, this is what the root ball looked like. On the next slide shows, on the other hand, this beautiful root ball on the right with these fine roots and just a very healthy look that's going to go into the ground, and with a little love and care and the appropriate planting will make a very healthy plant. One more problem that you can identify in the lower left are large roots. They may not be root bound, but nonetheless, if you see a specimen with very large roots, I would suggest to avoid it. Next, I think we have time for questions. If anyone has any in the chat box.
There is one more question. Can you please suggest a cure for sunburn on an apple tree?
No, I can't suggest a cure or a treatment for sunburn that has already occurred. What I can suggest for the following season is to try to avoid over pruning, which would be pruning that results in too big of a window between foliage that subsequently results in too much sun. This occurs primarily on, well, almost exclusively on the south and southwest sides of the tree where the sun comes most heavily. So the the sunburn occurs most frequently from over pruning. The other thing that may occur has to do with the timing of the pruning. If pruning is done in the winter, the tree will have some time to acclimatize as spring and the sun becomes warmer little by little. If over pruning is done in the middle of the summer, there you all of a sudden have a hole, and all of a sudden you have a tender bark being exposed to substantial heat. So I don't have a cure for burned bark, only preventative options.
Yeah, the difficulty about burned bark is that it doesn't heal. And what I do with my clients is that I take, it's like a jute tape or wrap, and I wrap it around the exposed bark. Even if it hasn't burned yet, but I know that it will burn because it doesn't have any foliage to cover it. And then I tie that with jute string, and I'll leave that on until I have enough foliage to cover it. And you can take branches and tie them so that they're covering that space. This is something particularly we do with Japanese maples to cover the crown, because the crown oftentimes gets bare. And tie it in there so that the foliage will begin to grow over it and shade it.
That was the only question. So.
Okay, let's see. I guess that's my turn. Okay. So the best time to plant a tree is in the winter when it's dormant. And the months that you want to avoid planting would be the hot summer months if possible. A lot of the root growth happens in the winter. So you all know the cycle of vegetative growth, which is that in the spring and starting now, plants start to bud up, then they start to leaf out, and they carry their leaves and do vegetative growth into the summer. And then if they're deciduous, they'll start dropping their leaves in the fall. But the roots also have a cycle, and the roots tend to grow, and it depends on what kind of plant, but they tend to grow in the winter, and then they slow down and that's setting them up for the vegetative growth. And then they'll slow down a bit, and then they'll grow again in the later summer. So you don't want to do it in the hot summer months if you can avoid it, because it's going to be really hard for the plant to establish its roots when it's getting exposed to a lot of sun. You don't want to plant when the soil is really wet. If you're out there when the soil is really wet, you're compacting the soil. The roots need both air and water. And when the soil is wet and you step on it, you expel all the air. You want to keep the plant moist and shaded until it goes in the ground. You don't want to let it dry out in the can. And you want to water the plant in the pot the day before you plant it out. One thing that happens with plants in pots is they can get super dry. So if you go to water it and you take the hose and you water it and the water floats on the top and doesn't sink in, that means that the soil has gotten super dry and it's repelling water. So you can take a little bit of dish soap and sprinkle it around on the soil. And so when you water it, it'll look soapy. Dish soap is a surfactant, and so it makes the soil absorb the moisture more. You can also, the other thing I do is I place it in a large saucer and put water in the saucer so that it begins to absorb it from the bottom. You don't want it to go into the ground really dry, because it'll take a really long time for it to get moist again.
The other thing about watering when you get a plant at home, that if it's very dry, sometimes the water will basically pour straight through. Sometimes the dry soil will separate from the side of the pot, and you water it and the water goes through rather quickly and you think, oh, fine, it's all wet. But the reason the water has gone through is not because the soil is entirely wet, but rather because the soil is separated from the side of the pot. So make certain that the soil is soaked.
Yeah, one other thing on this slide is you want to be there to supervise the planting. A lot of gardeners, especially mow and blow gardeners, think that they know what they're doing, and they don't. they haven't really been trained. And so you're gonna, you're probably gonna know more than they do. So you want to pay attention. So what you want ideally is a wide root plate, what we call a wide root plate. And the wider it is, the better the anchor is, and the more able it is to hold the tree upright, especially in wind. And also, when you have a wide root plate, the roots have a larger area to draw from. If there's a drought or if the irrigation fails, it's got more surface area to draw from. Let's see. So this slide actually is available in the handouts, so you'll get this at the end. This is really important. This is a critical part of making your tree happy and successful. So you don't want to dig the hole deeper than would allow the crown of the tree to be slightly above your grade, which is the existing soil level. So you're not going to dig down too deep, but you're going to dig about 3 times as wide as the pot. And you're going to take some of the native soil and mix it with your planting mix. If you don't do that, if you get some planting mix, you dig a hole, you put in the pot with the new planting mix, and the surrounding soil is clay, the roots are going to start growing in the planting mix, and they're going to get out to the edge of the hole, and they're going to hit clay, and they're going to go, not interested. And it'll start circling, and it'll become pot bound in the ground. So you want to mix the native soil with your planting mix, and then you want to take a shovel and cut the sides of the hole so that there's places for the roots to begin to penetrate into the clay. Let's see if there's anything else on this slide. If you're planting and you are planting something with, if you're planting a big tree and it comes what's called balled and burlapped, you want to take the burlap off when you put it in the ground. You don't want to plant it with that. And you can see in this drawing that the base of the trunk is just above ground level, which is what you want. Let's see. You're going to want to mulch, and you're going to want to make sure that the crown of the tree is above where the mulch layer is going to be, so that the mulch doesn't come up against the trunk.
Yeah, this is really a wonderful slide. It has very, very much in it in this one slide that we're covering in multiple slides.
Yeah, we're going to touch on a lot of this stuff. So we've talked about circling roots here, and one of the things you want to do before you plant is you want to cut those circling roots. Otherwise, they're going to keep going around and around and around. If you cut the roots and you cut in about 1/2 inch, the roots that are cut there on the outside go, oh, I don't have to keep going around and around. I can start to extend outwards. So I know it feels weird. I think Bill was saying how challenging it was to cut them, but I actually, I often would take off all of those roots you see there surrounding the root ball. So you're going to tamp your soil lightly as you backfill, and then you're going to water thoroughly to settle the soil, and then you're going to have to top it off. So I do this when I'm potting things up in a pot as well, is as I'm filling the pot with soil, I'm pushing it down with my hands. And then after I've filled it, I push it down with my hands some more all the way around, and then I water it in, and then I top it off because usually it's settled. When you're planting a larger tree, you might want to use a berm here, which will be, the berm actually will act as a kind of bowl to hold the water and help the water soak in. You want to mulch with about 2 inches of mulch. You should have that all over your garden. You don't want to do much more than that because of fire risk. And you want to keep the mulch about 12 inches away from the base of the tree. Staking.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll take these if I may.
Okay, great. Perfect.
May I?
Absolutely, yeah, I wasn't paying attention.
There we go. So it's staking. The staking that comes from the nursery is intended to facilitate moving the trees without breaking them. Remove those original stakes and those ties. The photograph here illustrates what happens if left on too long, in essence, girdling the tree. And although this tree looks like it survived, this girdling to this extent either makes a very poor tree or just outright kills it. So remove those original stakes and ties. When you do stake the tree, use a broad tie or a jute string, no wire, no zip ties. These can kill the top of the tree. And make sure that you check your ties at least twice a year. On the next slide, there's a little bit more detail in terms of installing 2 stakes perpendicular to the wind to allow movement. The movement of the tree when it's staked is critical. The movement tells the tree that when it bends, it needs to strengthen. And as it bends to one side, that side knows to shore up the strengthening part of the tree. Trees that are staked rigidly do not develop strength. So the 2 stakes are placed, 2 ties are placed around the lowest part of the tree that will still provide support. And then in a year or 2, when the tree is stable in the ground, they can be removed. I've been asked, when do you know it's actually stable? If you grab the tree by the trunk and gently push it away and then pull it toward you, the ground around the trunk shouldn't move. You should not see the original root ball moving within the ground at all. So if you do, then it hasn't been staked long enough.
I actually have a pistachio. I think it's been in the ground 4 years and it still can't stand up by itself.
So that's not the case, thankfully, with most trees, but pay attention and don't remove those stakes too soon. So next slide. Once you have it properly staked and are ready to irrigate, Katherine has already shown you that beautiful slide of the root plate of the tree and illustrates that in mature trees, most of the feeder roots are in the top 12 inches of the soil, and that they extend halfway from the trunk. They extend from the trunk to the drip line and then halfway again as much. So if that canopy or drip line is 10 feet from the trunk, then one would expect that the feeder roots could extend as about another 10 feet beyond. The next slide tells us about the irrigation equipment, and in particular the use of 1/2-inch inline drip placed in a spiral around the base of larger trees and shrubs, and we have a photo of that in a moment. This encourages the roots to move outward to form a wide root plate. The roots will grow toward the water, toward the irrigation. So don't use sprayers because those can rot the trunk. And don't use 2 emitters at the base because that's where the roots will go. Initially, after you've planted, wet irrigate thoroughly so that you get moisture to 12 inches of depth. So the next slide shows.
Yeah, let me just say one thing, Bill. It's just that actually we changed it in the notes. You can't, if you have a small tree or shrub, you can use the 2 emitters at the base. But for the larger ones, you really want to be able to expand it. So you want to use the inline.
So here's a photograph of that spiral arrangement and indicating that usually you'll need to irrigate for the first 3 years. I think that's in particular the case here, where we have several months of the year with no rain, several consecutive months with no rain. These young trees need consistent irrigation, which is to say it's better to water long and deep infrequently. That encourages deep roots. than it is to water very frequently with less time of irrigation. Make sure you check your irrigation system in the spring to make certain that it's working properly. And again, late summer, because as Katherine mentioned, that sun from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. can be brutal. Next slide. Even with established trees, and Katherine referred to this, in drought, particularly in the late summer and fall, irrigation can be required. And you can see this tree in the illustration having suffered considerable dieback. So this indicates that during drought stress, roots are dying back. It can take years for these trees to recover, and sometimes they don't, but when they do, it can take years. And it's important to note that when rains do start, it can take multiple rains to soak through mulch and into soil. If you haven't done so, after a first rain or second rain, sometimes third rain, I would encourage you to take a spade or shovel and dig 12 inches down, because especially after that first rain, I bet that you're going to find 12 inches down that it's absolutely bone dry. So next slide.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about this slide, Bill, is that there's actually a column of water that goes from the tips of the roots all the way up through the root structure, up the trunk, out the branches to the tips of the branches. And it is a continuous flow of water molecules. And the water evaporating from the leaves when they're growing sucks the water up from the roots. And when you have a drought and there's no water coming from the roots, that column of water gets broken. And that's why you begin to see the tops of the trees dying back. So this is something we saw a lot after the last drought. And you're probably going to see again this year. So we are now at, half of our average rain. You should be irrigating. You should not have your irrigation turned off because things are going to be dry. You can go out and check your soil. I think I'm irrigating at like 20% of what usually I do, but I try to be consistent because you don't want the soil to really dry out. Okay. So young tree pruning. So you don't want to do a lot of pruning when the tree's first going into the ground. Transplanting is going to be stressful for them, and you really want them to pay attention to their roots. And they're usually for the first year, they're going to be growing roots. They're not going to be growing vegetatively and probably not flowering and hopefully not fruiting yet. Just give them some time. You'll notice that once their roots are established, they will start to take off. So when you put it in the ground, it's okay to cut the dead and damaged branches out. No other vigorous pruning really until it's starting to grow. You want to leave some of the lower branches on for the first year or two. So the leaves and branches are feeding the limbs and trunks that they're closest to. That's where their carbohydrates are going for the most part. And so by leaving those little branches lower down, they're feeding the trunk and they're helping to increase the diameter of it. You can shorten them if you want, if they're sticking out too far and they're kind of getting in the way, but wait for a while until the tree's firmly established before you take them. Usually we leave the lower branches on when the trees are short, and then as the trees get taller, we start to raise the base of the tree, of the limbs. So we've covered a lot. Are there any questions just on this last section?
There are a couple of questions. The
Okay.
first one is about regarding the staking of a tree. When the wind is coming from all directions or from one direction, nearby trees are leaning in one direction from the wind. I guess that it's actually more of a comment now that I'm reading it, sorry. What suggestions about staking when the location is consistently windy from one direction?
Well, I think that I would stake as described, with the stakes perpendicular to the direction of the wind. And the stakes are obviously going to have to be more sturdy in a windy environment, and where the height up along the trunk probably would have to be a little bit higher than lower. And the tree left staked for longer. Other than those things, I don't have any recommendations, except possibly speaking with some arborists or aesthetic pruners who are familiar with that particular area and familiar with trees, those particular trees in that area. In terms of all of the trees leaning in one direction from the wind, again, I would ask experts most familiar, but my proclivity would be to stake the tree vertical until it is well established, and then let the environment prevail.
Yeah, there's, I go to a place in Corte Madera, which gets a lot of wind down in the flats, and they've put in some sycamore trees. They put in quite a few trees, and that's a place that gets high winds. And they actually put the stakes, instead of the stakes being next to the tree, they put them windward towards the wind side. And they really had to build a whole structure, practically a fence, deep in the ground, because they put large trees in. So one suggestion of what I make is you would start with a smaller tree, which is going to have less sail and going to be catching the wind less, and give it more time to establish its roots before it starts getting big and catching more wind. The other thing that I have often done is I lighten the vegetative growth so that it's not catching as much wind. So it's hard because you want the tree to be balanced, but you also don't want it to catch so much wind.
Okay, there is also a question about the spiral drip line for trees. The question is, with the drip line for trees, should it start 6 inches away from the trunk and spiral all the way out to the drip line, each spiral 6 inches apart, or something else? And then sort of a follow-up, would or could the spiral be unwound and opened up as moved farther away from the trunk as the tree grows?
To the second question, the answer is basically yes. The spiral should be, I guess, unwound is the best way to put it, or perhaps even lengthened. But yes, it should be expanded to promote feeder roots growing further apart. In terms of starting 6 inches away from the trunk and every 6 inches, I don't think it's necessary to be precise. Some trees require more water than others. In some climates, you're going to need more water than others. In some soils, you're going to need more water than others. Katherine, do you want to comment on this? This may be a question for local experts, and it may simply be experimenting with your irrigation system to see whether that water for that amount of time with that amount of half-inch tubing is getting the water down to 6 to 10 to 12 inches.
Yeah, it depends on the size of it. I put in a bunch of 5-gallon trees so they were relatively small about 4 years ago, and we did the spiral of the half-inch inline, and we just started moving it out. So the roots in general are going to be moving outward from the trunk, so they're not going to be that many roots near the trunk itself. A lot of people put those. Reason I hate putting 2 emitters on either side of it for a large tree is that the roots are not there anymore. The roots are out. So planting a 5-gallon tree, putting 2 emitters next to it and expecting it to grow forever doesn't make any sense, because the roots are moving away from the base of the trunk. And the other thing is, if it's a smaller plant, I can also use the 1/4 inch inline. in a spiral around it. I use that a lot on my pots. Did that answer the question, I think?
I haven't seen any more questions, so I think it's good.
So is that all the questions?
That's all we have so far, yes.
Okay. So we've covered the purpose of the tree, deciding what the purpose of it is, evaluating your site, researching so that you can make sure you get the right tree, how to pick the plant out at the nursery, how to plant it, how to stake it, how to irrigate it, and how to prune it. Again, the handouts that we have for you, they go into the climate zones. They give you some websites for doing plant research. You can also just do, Google the plant name. And I oftentimes get a lot of information from the San Francisco Chronicle. Has a columnist who writes columns about specific plants in the Bay Area. And so just Googling a plant can bring up a lot of information. We've talked about on the web, on the resources sheet, there's a link for the Aesthetic Pruners Association if you want to find a local pruner. Also the irrigation stores, I know that Urban Farmer and I think some of the others provide free irrigation classes. Irrigation is pretty easy if you're paying attention. We've got Urban Farmer, which we have here in Mill Valley, and I think there's other locations. There's also Water Savers and Ewing in San Rafael. I also list nurseries. We've got the local nurseries where you can walk in and find the plant, or oftentimes they can order it if you want. There's also a list of nurseries up in Sonoma and around there, which offer different kinds of plants. And also on the handout is more information about Marin Master Gardeners. I've got the website down there, the phone number. We have a help desk, and usually you would be able to walk into the office in Novato and bring in an issue if you had a question about your plant. Because of COVID, the office is closed, but you can still send an email in, and that is listed on the resources page. They take a while to answer because of COVID, so be patient. Master Gardeners also has the leaflet, which is a newsletter. So if you just go to the website for Marin Master Gardeners, you can find a link for that so that you can get it sent to you. And yeah, this is the resources sheet, and you can see it has all that information on it. And here's contact information for Marin Master Gardeners. Okay.
So I can send the resource list to everyone who attended today. And just so you know, if you want to review any of this, in about a week, it'll be on the Marin County Free Library YouTube site. And I want to thank Katherine and Bill for the time and all the great information about how to keep young plants turning into beautiful plants as they age. So thank you very, very much.
Great, thank you all. And now we'll hang out for a little while if anybody has some specific questions. And just post them on the chat box. Thank you all very much.